Hi, my name is Sergiusz, and I would like to show you how you can have software as a service in a regular Kubernetes cluster using kube-bind and CRDs. So what you see here is a terminal. First of all, in the upper part, in the light terminal, you see a regular like consumer cluster, customer cluster, whatnot, which would like to consume some database. In this case, I would like to consume a cockroach database. On the lower side, you see the parts that are running on the service provider side. Obviously, these things are not usually seen by the consumer. So on the left-hand side, you sort of like see the namespaces on a service provider cluster. And most notably, you can see a cockroach operator, which provisions the actual cockroach database if the consumer or the customer wants it. Note that the cockroach operator is running on a Kubernetes cluster on the service provider side, which in no way has a connection to the consumer cluster up here. The canonical way would be to run the cockroach-DB operator on the consumer cluster, but we want to have a software as a service. So what do we do instead? We use kube-bind. The other thing that runs on the service provider side is this backend component, which usually would be deployed as a controller or as an operator, which is exposed via ingress as this export endpoint. So let's hit this. And what you are presented then is with a link that you can invoke from here, or just kind of QR code if you like, which lets you authorize the service provider side. In this case, we just set up DEX for the sake of simplicity. Then you are granting access such that the service provider is allowed to provision a database for you. Next, you are being presented with a list of possible APIs to consume from this service provider cluster. We are most notably interested in the cockroach-DB API, which is crdb.cockroachlabs.com. So let's bind that API. Success. The API is bound to the consumer cluster. And what is happening here, at the same time, you see the example backend controller doing its job on the provider side. And what you also see here on the service provider side, a namespace was being created that holds the bookkeeping resources to be connected to the consumer cluster. On the above, you see some bookkeeping that is being done on the consumer cluster at all. Most notably, you see a kube-bind namespace being created that holds a lightweight agent that implements the synchronization mechanism of that API. And most importantly, you can also create cockroach database API custom resources in the consumer cluster, despite the fact that there is no operator running on it. So I've taken this example here from the documentation of cockroach-DB operator that creates a simple cockroach-DB. And we are going to expose the web UI of that cockroach-DB via an ingress that is provisioned all on the service provider side. So let's create that one. As you can see here on the service provider side, another namespace was being created that is prefixed with the session of the consumer and suffixed with the database of the consumer, which in this case is called MyDB. As you can also see, we created a cockroach-DB custom resource, and you see various conditions being synchronized from the cockroach operator at the service provider side. Note that there is not a single pod running on the consumer side of things. However, when you look at the service provider side, you see that there is a cockroach-DB being provisioned, as well as an ingress object. In the consumer cluster, you don't see a pod. You also don't see an ingress, but you do see a successful CockroachDB custom resource. And finally, you can also invoke the web UI of the CockroachDB that was being provisioned for you. Here we go. We have a Cockroach database provisioned at a service provider just by pure API in a consumer cluster. And there is no pods running on our side.